Blueprint for Separation, Family Separation in the Context of Residential Schools. Topics covered in this presentation include background information on what motivated the Crown to pursue a policy of separation and what goals this was meant to advance. We will also address some key events in how the policy of separation came to be, and will review how it was implemented and enforced, specifically the placement of residential schools, the policies by which they were run and funded, and the pass system in place beginning 1885. As we have learned, there was a desire to erase Indigenous identity, and the pursuit of this was seen as best achieved by intervening as early as possible in the life of the status Indian. To what end was this done, and how is it to play out? One clue can be found in the so-called Gradual Civilization Act 1857, which required, not permitted, but required, the enfranchisement of any male Indian over 21 who was able to speak, read, and write in English or French, was of good moral character, and was free of debt. Once enfranchised, the civilized Indian was fully absorbed into the body politic and was no longer considered an Indian, losing the rights afforded to him under treaties. Over time, this could be foreseen to eliminate entire nations with which the Crown had made treaties. Eventually, the status Indian, to which the Crown had treaty obligations, would cease to exist. So where did the idea of beginning the so-called civilization process as early as practical begin? We can see early moves in this direction in the Davin Report. Nicholas Flood Davin had visited the United States to study their industrial schools for Indigenous children. In his report, officially titled The Report on Industrial Schools for Indians and Half-Breeds, he recommended that Canada follow the same policy of aggressive civilization as the United States. If anything is to be done with the Indian, we must catch him very young. The children must be kept constantly within the circle of civilized conditions, Davin reported. This report would contribute to the establishment and spread of the residential school system. The idea that Indigenous people should be pushed to adopt European ways of living extends even farther back, all the way to the first Taino people brought to Europe by Christopher Columbus. Within Canada specifically, we can look to the Bagot Commission. This commission viewed the Mohawk Institute of Ontario as a model for residential schools and for the policy of separating children from their families. This commission prepared its report from 1842 to 1844. Interestingly, the Mohawk Institute was originally located near the adjacent Six Nations Mohawk village. However, the government forced the people of Six Nations to relocate further away from the school. This happened over the period of 1837 to 1841, being finalized the year before the Bagot Commission began its report, which proposed the Mohawk Institute as a model for other residential schools. John A. Macdonald, Canada's first Prime Minister, during his second stay in office, said, "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly pressed on myself as the head of the department that the Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men." The placement of residential schools presented challenges for families who wished to remain in contact with their children. This map shows the location of the Shingwauk Residential School, first opened 1873. Shingwauk housed students from as far away as Walpole Island, some 450 kilometers crow's flight distance and much longer when traveled over land. Susie Kicknosway was from Walpole Island and attended Shingwauk. She returned home for one summer at the age of 9 or 10, but her time away had strained family relationships. Sent to Shingwauk at age 4, she had few memories of her family. This separation during childhood would haunt her later in life. When raising her own children, she had no behavior to model, apart from what she experienced in Shingwauk, which she termed supervision rather than parenting. St. Michael's is another example of the distances children would be transported over. While children from nearby communities would attend, the remoteness of native communities assured that many children would be sent to schools far from home. Even if a school was close to one reserve, it would take in children from remote communities that made access for families difficult, if not impossible. St. Michael's was located on an island in Alert Bay, hardly a central location, and housed students from as far away as Bella Coola and Prince Rupert, a crow's flight distance of over 400 kilometers. For many years, the maritime provinces were without a residential school. Children from across Atlantic Canada were sent to Shubenacadie beginning in February 1930. Part of the impetus for the school's creation was that the Crown was paying Mi'kmaq families to care for orphaned Indigenous children. It was felt that stipends for this were causing idleness among the foster families. The school was run like an orphanage, but intact families were not spared from the effects of the only residential school east of Ontario. Prior to 1945, Shubenacadie's children were forbidden from visiting home even during summer break. This applied even though parents were willing to pay for transportation, and even in the case of children whose families lived on the nearby Shubenacadie Reserve. When parents visited in 1939 to take their children home for Christmas, staff contacted the mounted police to have them escorted away without their children. There was variety in how schools handled vacation for children. The policy goal was to limit the ability of children to return home, even during breaks in instruction. Government feared the influence of reserve life and how it may undo the effects of residential schooling, and viewed vacation as a sanctioned form of truancy. Industrial schools were funded based on per capita grants, and the Crown's calculation of these made home visits less likely. The grant was calculated quarterly, requiring attendance for at least 85 days of each 91-day quarter for a full payment. This meant that schools could permit, at most, 12 days off at a time without financial penalty. In some schools, only a fraction of students could leave during summer. At Shingwalk, for example, 1/3 were kept at the school over summer break to perform chores. In the case of students who did return home during the break, their parents bore the transportation cost. Parents were also required to pay a deposit when enrolling their children, which would be forfeited if the child left early or did not return from holiday. While both the Anglican Church and the Crown agreed that limiting holidays was in keeping with their mission, there was conflict over how to balance family separation and the willingness of families to turn over their children. The Anglicans felt that the policy should be explained to Native community leaders, and that greater allowance ought be made for children from more distant communities. Indian Commissioner Reid disagreed and was opposed to any measure that would lead to more students attending for less time. In other words, the school's mission could be best accomplished by keeping children from their home community as much as possible. Hayter Reid was known to some Native people as Ironheart, and was a key figure in the late 19th century Department of Indian Affairs. He was instrumental in several aspects of family separation. First appointed Indian agent in 1881, he rose to the position of Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs in 1893. In addition to his involvement in the residential school system, Reid is known for his peasant farming policy, which restricted the abilities of Indigenous farmers to compete with Euro-Canadians. He is also, and perhaps most infamously, known for his promulgation of the pass system. This system has its origins in the Northwest Rebellion of Louis Riel, but remained in effect until the 1940s despite having no basis in law. It required Indigenous people to obtain written permission to leave the reserves. While school locations and limited vacation allotment did much to keep children from leaving residential schools, the issue remained of families visiting their children at the schools, in some cases by traveling hundreds of kilometers. The pass system served to limit the mobility of those parents willing and able to make the journey. Agents would often deny passes if the purpose was to visit children at a residential school. Attempts to leave without a pass would see people return to the reserve or, in some cases, jailed. The power wielded by Indian agents, including their sway over Native ability to bring produce to market, meant that agents' discretion was unquestionable, despite the pass system having no basis in law. The commissioner of the Northwest Mounted Police protested the illegal system as early as 1893, but was overruled by Reid. The lack of any legal basis for this policy was well understood even at the top levels of government. John A. Macdonald, in his second term, supported the policy while explicitly acknowledging it was in contravention of Native treaty rights. In a letter dated 1885, he stated, "Should resistance be offered on the ground of treaty rights, the obtaining of a pass should not be insisted upon as regards loyal Indians. This, along with comments from Reed, makes clear that the government knew this system was not legal but would apply it anyway when it was felt necessary. As Indian Commissioner, Reed preferred the establishment of industrial schools far from reserves to minimize visitation. However, parents made efforts to visit their children despite the distance. Principal Albert Lacombe at High River proposed a fence to ensure that parents camping outside would be denied any influence on their children. Other schools had a room for visiting parents known as the Indian Reception Room. By controlling these visits, a carefully curated image could be presented to Native parents to encourage attendance. In these schools, visitation was allowed as often as parents could obtain passes at the whim of their local Indian agent, who was often discouraged from issuing passes for this purpose. Other measures to keep parents in line with the government's control of access to their children included refusing food rations to parents who arrived without a pass, and bureaucratic pressures applied by the Department of Indian Affairs on principals who were too welcoming of visiting family. In summary, a variety of policies that on their own ranged from petty or bureaucratic to simply logistical and geographical realities combined to form a large-scale policy in line with government objectives that, by modern definitions, are clearly culturally genocidal. When leeway within these policies was used to facilitate family contact, it was discouraged or overruled. The specific responsibility to keep families separated was diffused among Indian agents and school administrators, was encouraged through financial incentives, and enforced through economic coercion of Native communities. But throughout the large-scale system, voices at high levels of government pursued a consistent policy directed at destroying cultural continuity from one generation to the next.